South Texas, 1840. On the bank of Chicolete Creek, northeast of the town of Victoria, a large, bearded man sits alone next to a small campfire. Though the oppressive Texas sun has sunk into the horizon several hours ago, he cannot sleep. As he stares into the campfire, he wonders what is worse, to stay awake recalling the memories, or to fall asleep and relive them in his nightmares. His knuckles whiten as he grips the handle on his knife and stares intensely into the flames. On this night, like so many others, his thoughts are not here in his Spartan one-man camp that he shares only with his trusted horse, Pepperpot. They are now firmly ensconced in the memory from a few years earlier on a farmstead 60 miles away, on the banks of the Guadalupe River. The man's name is Jeff Turner, and he had come to Texas from Kentucky in the 1830s. He had been born and raised in the Bluegrass State and had always planned on making his way as a farmer near the place of his birth. He had married a young woman from his hometown near the Beach Fork, and within a few years, the young couple had a small but thriving farm and 3 young sons. Life was good. Then, one day, a stranger stopped by the Turner's family farm asking if he might trouble them for a hot meal and a night's boarding. This was not wholly uncommon in the area at the time, and he was welcomed inside for a dinner and a night's rest. As the family ate, Jeff Turner and the traveler conversed about the man's ultimate destination. The man said he was on his way south, as many in Kentucky were at the time. He was headed to a land of open, free country, with rich lands for farming and cattle, hills and valleys replete with wild game, rivers teeming with fish, all open for the taking for any settler with enough gumption and drive to do so. He was heading, the traveler said, to Texas. The next morning, the traveler had gone on his way, and the Turner family returned to their daily chores and social interactions. However, Jeff Turner could not shake the thought of Texas from his mind. Though his family had lived comfortably, they lived meagerly. And while this had sufficed for his small brood until now, there was little to no hope of amassing enough wealth to pass on to his children, nor to ensure his wife's perpetual comfort upon his passing. For months, Jeff Turner was dogged by the notion that he could and should have been doing more to provide a future for his wife and young children. Finally, he made up his mind that the Turners would sell their farm and move to Texas. It would take months more of convincing his reluctant wife that this was the right decision, as the prospect of leaving their moderate but reliable lifestyle seemed, at first, far too daunting for the young mother. After all, Texas was known for more than just its tales of prosperity and progress. Though it would soon establish itself as an independent republic which ostensibly laid claim to lands from Matagorda Bay to today's Oklahoma Panhandle, everyone knew that Texas did not really belong to the Texians. Nor had it belonged to their predecessors in the Mexican government, nor the Mexicans' predecessors in the Spanish. Texas, for the last century and a half, had belonged to the Comanche. Even for residents of Kentucky in the 1830s, the stories of the atrocities being wrought across Texas were unlike anything they had heard before. Their forefathers had long fought the resident tribes of Kentucky, like the Shawnee and the Cherokee. They had subjected and been subject to all manner of violent encounters that had seen men, women, and children on both sides needlessly slaughtered for decades, if not centuries. And still, for many, the accounts of the few who had survived a raid by the Comanches were jaw-dropping. Countless Spanish missionaries and Mexican settlers, as well as nearly every tribe who offered even the most tacit resistance or imposition, like the Tonkawa, Waco, Delaware, Kickapoo, and the Apache, had fallen victim to the merciless depredations of the Comanche. Time and again, entire families, even entire villages, had been simply wiped out. All the men would be killed, as well as any children not old or able enough to be self-sufficient. Women would be doomed to a life as slaves and concubines, often ultimately being killed themselves when no longer of use or interest to their masters. But despite the volume and veracity of the horrific reports that seemed to flood out of the burgeoning republic, the settlers, replete with their dreams of fortune and legacy, continued to pour into the territory. And, just as so many had done before him, in the fall, after being visited by the Texas-bound traveler, Jeff Turner finally convinced his justifiably reluctant wife that the prospective risk was worth the potential reward. Turner sold the farm for a decent profit, and the young family packed everything they owned and made their way south to the Republic of Texas. After spending a few weeks near San Antonio, the family made their way to the Guadalupe River, following its southeasterly course, which ultimately ends in the Gulf of Mexico. It would be here, on a tributary likely not far from the present-day towns of Seguin and Gonzales, that Jeff Turner and his family would stake their claim. Turner, with the help of his two eldest sons, built a small cabin and in the early spring had begun to clear the brush and bramble around the family's home in order to plant crops. Though she had been reluctant to leave their Kentucky home, Mrs. Turner began to warm to the trappings of their new homestead. The stories had indeed been true. The land was rich for farming. Her husband had no trouble in keeping the family well fed on wild game, and the creek that ran nearby was both bountiful and beautiful. It seemed that, after many months, the arduous trip and countless dangers and hardships had been, in fact, worth it. The Turner family had found their home in Texas, and they were happy. Then, one morning early that May, Jeff Turner set out with his rifle on a hunt. Before he left, he took time to absorb the totality of his bucolic home front scene. His three sons, all under the age of 10, played near the stream. They used sticks to roll along waist-high hoops of wood made by tying the ends of a slender branch together. This game was common throughout European, American, and many indigenous cultures throughout the world. The game was a favorite amongst his young sons, and the unmistakable looks of carefree joy on their faces gave their father a sense of great satisfaction. On the side of the cabin, in the family's small vegetable garden, Mrs. Turner was busy pruning and pricking as she sang her favorite songs in a lovely, lilting tone. She cheerily bid her husband farewell, seemingly without breaking meter in the song that she was singing. Jeff Turner's heart was full as he ventured down the small creek and around a bend, finding himself in the middle of a timbered thicket before going much more than a mile. The day would be warm, Turner had thought, but even if there were no game about, it would be nice to take a walk and explore parts of this scenic track in more depth than he had yet done. In the silence of the early morning, the rippling of the small stream seemed to grow to a din. Then, suddenly, the tranquility of the rolling water was broken by the percussive retort of what sounded like a dozen or more rifles. And, all at once, Jeff Turner found himself awash in pure, cold terror. Visions of the worst possibilities flashed through his mind as he took off in a dead run towards his homestead. Then, seconds later, he heard the screams. They were a mix of the triumphant war cries interspersed with the shrieks of his beloved family. Before Turner reached the bend around which lay the cabin, the sound became that of only war cries. Finally coming into view of the house, Turner was met with a scene of utter devastation. He approached from the front, with the attack having come from the rear of the house. Coming through the door, he saw the bodies of his beloved wife and his youngest son. They appeared pale with the great loss of blood, the young child clasped desperately in his mother's arms, as she had apparently done all within her power to protect him. Near the back door lay the bodies of his two older sons, who despite their youth had apparently also fought to the last while wounded and bleeding profusely. Both were covered in blood and freshly scalped. Just as Turner had taken in this horrific sight, the Comanche came back, dismounting and walking idly towards the cabin, presumably unaware of Turner's return. Blind with rage and grief, and not fearing for his own life with the loss of all he had held dear, Turner instantaneously sprung from the door, placing a lead ball from his already loaded hunting rifle into the heart of one of the approaching Comanche, killing him instantly. Then, drawing his large hunting knife from his belt, Turner, in his own words, rushed upon the balance like a tiger. Still shocked that the cabin was no longer empty and at the sudden death of their cohort, the Comanche were in a momentary disarray. This afforded Turner enough time to inflict mortal wounds on several of them as they attempted to flee back to their mounts. The ensuing few minutes, by Turner's later account, were a blur. Like a rabid animal, he slashed and cut at any moving body he could until being felled by a volley of shots from Comanche rifles. He lay on the ground, yards away from his dearly departed family, his own blood draining into the dirt. The warriors, at this point unsure if there would be any more unexpectedly returning Texians, decided to take their bounty of foodstuffs and flesh and disappear into the rolling hills and elm tree thickets. Turner lay on the floor of his cabin, unconscious from the loss of blood, coming into consciousness only for brief, presumably traumatic bouts. At some point during that afternoon, a neighbor passing by the Turner farm noticed it was uncharacteristically quiet for a family of 3 young boys and industrious, fastidious parents. Seeing fit to further investigate, the kindly neighbor was met with the same macabre scene that had greeted Jeff Turner only hours before, only now with several additionally grievously mutilated bodies. According to the neighbor's later account, Turner was found lying across the body of one of his Comanche attackers, with his hands around the warrior's throat and the other hand stiffly grasping the knife that he had driven between the warrior's ribs, all the way to the hilt. Nearby lay 3 more warriors, all with horrific wounds inflicted by the knife now buried in their comrade. Amidst what must have been not only a psychologically traumatizing situation, but a viscerally revolting one, the neighbor saw the faintest signs of life in Turner and, through much effort on his own part, managed to pull Turner out of the cabin, drape him across his horse, and get the nearly dead man back to his own homestead. Here, he tended to Turner's wounds with the help of his own family and other neighbors. Upon initial examination, most among them thought it to be but a matter of time. Jeff Turner did not succumb to his wounds. For weeks, he was plagued by fever dreams and great pains throughout the whole of his beleaguered body. With time and great care, though, the staunch but pitiable frontiersman made his way back to physical health. But the man's mind had been forever scarred. He found the memories too much to bear, an interaction with anyone not privy to his grief far too exhaustive an endeavor to participate in for long. Instead, he had taken to living alone in the wilds of central Texas. He abandoned all notions of family and farming and set his sights on his life's new, sole purpose: revenge. For years, Turner spent every waking moment tracking parties of Comanche deep into their own territories. Turner would initiate a one-man campaign of terror and violence that would hound the Comanche and garner him renown amongst settlers of the area. Still, even amongst the settlers grateful for his undertakings, there was a pervasive underlying attitude of both pity for and fear of the clearly traumatized and now openly homicidal lone frontiersman. Though his exploits had continued to build his formidable and frightening reputation, Turner remained a deeply troubled man. Every night since he had regained some measure of cogency, he had spent pondering the same question he pondered now, several years later, at his camp on the Chicolete Creek. Was it better to fall asleep or to be kept awake by the memories? He still had no answer. The next day, Turner makes his way towards a nearby settlement in hopes of garnering himself some supplies. He dreads the trip, not only for the distance, but for the interactions it will undoubtedly require. However, on this day, the settlement is abuzz. A group of Texas Rangers, the still young but already notorious law enforcement/military group, have just walked into town. They walked because that morning, all of their horses had been stolen by raiding Comanche. These rangers have come into town footbound, angry, and, of course, slightly embarrassed. They are set on procuring themselves new horses and then promptly heading out to exact their revenge on the offending Comanche. They are in luck, as a fresh remuda of horses has just been brought into the settlement by a local rancher. The rancher tells the rangers that they can have any horse that they like from his herd in order to give chase to the Comanche. And after 15 minutes of cautiously saddling and mounting the barely broke animals, the rangers were on the trail of the raiding party that had stolen their horses and agreed for their collective pride. Among this group of young rangers is the 23-year-old rookie William Alexander Anderson Wallace, better known to history as Bigfoot Wallace. Though he will go on to a legendary career with the Rangers, the young man is a relative neophyte to combat with the Comanche at this time. He leads this party, but is notably nervous and unsure. He is all too aware of the dangers posed by this chase, and all but devoid of any experience. As his mind churns through the machinations of tracking and trailing the elusive raiding party, he hears the barely perceptible plodding of a rider trailing them from not far away. Momentarily, all of the young rangers brace for an attack. Then, seemingly simultaneously, they all holster their weapons and exchange unsure glances as the figure of Jeff Turner approaches, mounted on his raw-boned and ill-tempered horse. Though all are inexperienced in combat with the Comanche, these young men have all led combative, adventurous lives in which they had seen many of the more colorful characters the frontier had to offer. But none of them have seen anything quite like Jeff Turner. Bigfoot Wallace gives his personal account in this excerpt from The Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace by John C. Duvall, linked to purchase in the description. The account is as follows. I saw a man riding up rapidly on our trail. When he got to where I was, he reined in his horse, evidently intending to wait for me, and I had a chance of observing as curious a specimen as I ever saw before in any country. He was a tall, spare-built chap, dressed in buckskin hunting shirt and leggings, with a coonskin cap on, a long, old-fashioned flint and steel Kentucky rifle on his shoulder, and a tomahawk and scalping knife stuck in his belt. His hair was matted together and hung around his neck in great uncombed swaths. His eyes peered out from among it as bright as a couple of mesquite coals. I have seen all sorts of eyes, of panthers, wolves, catamounts, leopards, and Mexican lions, but I never saw eyes that glittered and flashed and advanced about like those in that man's head. Bigfoot Wallace asks Turner if he is a stranger in these parts. Turner informs him tersely that he is not only not a stranger, but that he knows every watering hole between their present location and the Rio Grande. Wallace asks the man if he is not afraid to travel alone in such dangerous territory, over such a wide expanse of country. Quoting again from Wallace's personal account, he grinned sort of a sickly smile, and his fingers clutched the handle of his tomahawk, and his eyes danced a perfect jig in his head. No, he answered, the Indians are more afraid of me than I am of them. If they knew I was waylaying a particular trail, they would go 40 miles out of their way to give me a wide berth. But the trouble is, they never know where to find me. And besides, the best horse this side of the Brazos can't come along old Pepperpod when I want him to work in the lead. With this, Jeff Turner put spurs to his mount, causing the animal to rear up in a maneuver Wallace determined would have thrown all but the most skillful of horsemen. Turner informs the Rangers that his family had been murdered by the Comanche a decade earlier, and that he now spends his time in pursuit of perpetual retribution. As he recalls the murder of his wife and young children, his eyes grow even wilder. His hands begin to shake, and his manner becomes agitated to that of a man on the proverbial edge. He tells the Rangers that he has 46 Comanche scalps hanging from the walls of his lodge on Chicolete Creek, and that he intends to add far more. To what must have been a mixed reaction of reluctance and relief, Turner offers his services to the novice Rangers in tracking and killing the Comanche raiding party. Though many of the Rangers are unnerved by the man's mannerisms, they agree that his skill set and experience could provide quite helpful, even vital, assistance in their task at hand. And so it was that the man known as Jeff Turner the Indian Hater came to ride with the vaunted and venerable Texas Ranger legend, Bigfoot Wallace. The party would immediately head west, with Turner's tracking skills proving invaluable in the succeeding few days. After much hard riding, they would eventually come upon the camp of raiding Comanche. Here, many of the Rangers would see their first taste of combat, and Jeff Turner would forever solidify his reputation as a vicious fighter and a deeply troubled man. Wallace would go on to an illustrious career with the Rangers, and Turner would eventually meet his fate at the hands of his hated enemy, dying a hard death in a hard land. But for tonight, those are other stories for other times. Thank you for tuning into this episode of History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to click like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support our work on Patreon, you can find the link below in the description. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, History Too Real for the Westerns.